step up and has to
agreement on
take
security
on
guarantees should come before any agreement.
Механизмом принятия решений по использованию военных
Europe has
сил.
been vilified as an age slow, fragmented, constrained, sidelined.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-à-vis Europe is not Russia, is the threat from within.
Zerreißt Europa, zerreißt Deutschland.
The Art of Diplomacy. The official podcast of the Munich Security Conference.
Hello and welcome back to The Art of Diplomacy. My name is Joshua Yaffa, and for this 7th episode, I'm once again joined by Benedikt Franke, Vice Chairman and CEO of the Munich Security Conference. Benedikt, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, and the fact that I made it to the 7th episode is surprising to me, and I'm sure many others.
We're all happy to be here. Today's guest is Wendy Sherman, one of the most experienced diplomats of her generation. I'm sure you're familiar with her biography. Benedikt, I'll run through it quickly for listeners. She began her career as counselor to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She was deeply involved, in fact, led negotiations, was the point person in the State Department for negotiations with North Korea about that country's nuclear program. She later served as U.S. Secretary of State. And what we talked about quite extensively in this episode was her experience as the lead American negotiator of the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. Sherman was also the director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as a senior fellow at Harvard's Belford Center for Science and International Affairs, and the author of the 2018 book on her years in the diplomatic service, Not for the Faint of Heart. Wendy Sherman spent years negotiating with some of the most difficult and perhaps least understood counterparties on some of the more consequential security issues of our time. And what struck me in our conversation is how she approaches diplomacy not as an abstract concept. It's not so much a question of kind of theory or general principles, but as a real practical craft knowledge, one that depends a lot on preparation, persistence, expertise, and a deep understanding of the people sitting across the table. I wonder, Benedikt, I'm sure Wendy Sherman is someone you've crossed paths with many times, followed her career, certainly followed the issues that she has worked on. What stands out to you about her career and the problem sets that she's faced over the course of her diplomatic career?
You know, Wendy is a long-standing friend of the Munich Security Conference. For me, she is the perfect diplomat. And for me, she's also the perfect guest of this podcast. When we talk about the art of diplomacy, Wendy has practiced it for decades. So I totally buy this idea that diplomacy, you know, is not just an art, it is also a craft. And the best diplomats have both this deep understanding of the craft, of the instruments, of the processes, of the concepts, of the nitty-gritty, but also the personal charm, the character to create trust. What struck me in the interview is how focused Wendy was on everything but the trust issue. I am convinced that she is absolutely right on the enormous, efforts that need to go into true diplomacy, true and hopefully successful negotiations. But I do also believe that we must not forget that the currency of diplomacy is trust. That if you aren't able to build up trust in negotiations, you can be the best craftsman. You can be, you can have designed the best process. You know everything about your opposition figure. It will not last very long.
Well, that's an interesting point because there's this tension that came out in our conversation where Wendy, yes, talked about the ideal of building trust, but that also in some cases it might not be there. For example, in her dealings with Iranian counterparties during the JCPOA negotiations, she said, I didn't necessarily trust them or they didn't necessarily trust me, but still we had to find a way to, at minimum, understand each other and to take into consideration, not at all agree, but to at least kind of understand and incorporate into our own models the other side's interests, constraints, and motivations.
And I don't think it is a tension at the end. I do believe that good diplomacy generates trust. It doesn't necessarily, prey on trust. It doesn't necessarily necessitate trust, but it generates trust. So I think, she is both right in saying that it's much more important that you understand your opponent than to trust him. And I think, maybe underplaying this importance of aiming at building trust in a negotiation. If you don't trust the other side to implement what you've just agreed, if you don't trust the other side to actually believe in what you've just signed, this is not sustainable diplomacy. And so I don't think there is a tension. You need diplomacy in a trust-free environment, but the essence, the purpose, the raison d'être of good diplomacy is to generate trust that turns, short-term negotiations into sustainable frameworks and ideally long-term peace. And let me just add a little thought here. And I'm not clear myself about the balance between art and craft, but I do believe that it is not just craft. I do believe that there are famous diplomats out there, and we know their names, whose personal charm, whose, deep sense of responsibility, whose openness, so whose character at the end of the day have provided shortcuts in negotiations, have made the application of the craft easier. And so what I'm asking myself, is the art a necessary part of the craft?
One last question. You talked about some of these titans of diplomacy from the past, and those are histories and stories we've gone back to a lot over the season. I want to ask you a question that I ask Wendy Sherman toward the end of our talk, and that's about the future and the future of diplomacy. And there are all sorts of factors. You know them well. Our listeners know them well. A kind of short-termism in both domestic politics, but also in geopolitics. And it's very difficult, even for diplomats, to engage in long, sustained work. Political winds change, elections come, throw out incumbents, bring in new parties with new priorities. The media environment has shifted in ways that also affect the kind of spectrum of the possible, both in politics and geopolitics. It's not by accident, for example, as Wendy and I talked about, that the original JCPOA was not actually a treaty, which would have required U.S. Congress to ratify it, but an executive action, which then President Obama could do on his own, and which meant President Trump could then undo. And so my question for you is, do you think that a certain era of diplomacy for these structural reasons has passed, that it's harder, maybe in some ways impossible, in the future to imagine the same kind of day in, day out, drawn out, persistent marathon is a word we used with Wendy Sherman in talking about the JCPOA negotiations, that sort of diplomacy is on its way out if it hasn't passed already?
I think I have a strong opinion on that. And that is that we over-focus on things like, making fun of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff flying around the world and, doing their quick ins and quick outs, that we over-focus on the unfortunate mix of personal and state interests, that we focus on these things because they make for great stories. And we underestimate that there is still a lot of hard diplomacy being done every day, even by actors like the Trump administration and certainly by actors in Europe, but also by the Chinese and others. The world has become a lot more complex. There is an obvious need for diplomacy, bilaterally and multilaterally, as global institutions weaken and the architecture fragments. So I would say the need for real diplomacy is more obvious than ever to most actors. And hence I see in my own country, in Germany, but also within the European Union and certainly across the transatlantic alliance, a renaissance of true diplomacy. And when we look at the recent Iran conflict and the role of mediators like Pakistan and Qatar, what they are doing is real diplomacy. That's not cocktail diplomacy. That is hard work. Dozens, if not hundreds of meetings, carefully crafted timelines. And I have a feeling that the current media environment doesn't appreciate that enough.
That's an interesting thought, and one that definitely informs my own thinking on the conversation I had with Wendy Sherman. Thanks for chatting today, Benedict. What follows is my interview with Wendy Sherman for The Art of Diplomacy.
Thanks for having me. I hope I'll make it to the 8th episode after having said all what I've just said.
Looking forward.
Thank you.
Ambassador Sherman, thanks so much for joining me on Art of Diplomacy.
Good to be with you, Josh. Thank you.
Now, I understand you started your diplomatic career in the State Department working under Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a legendary figure in the annals of diplomacy. And I saw that you made some interesting comments about how early on in your time in the State Department with Madeleine Albright as a boss and mentor, really, you mentored her on feminism, and she mentored you on national security and foreign policy. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about that two-way mentorship.
Sure. So I actually began at the State Department before Madeleine Albright became secretary. I began under Warren Christopher as the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs. But what really matters where Madeleine is concerned is that she was a political ally years before either of us were doing diplomacy. She, of course, had a PhD in international affairs. She went to Columbia. She spoke Russian. She spoke Czech. She spoke French. She was very much part of Europe. And she was a child of Munich, not as I was a child of Vietnam, in terms of how we became politically of age. And she was a decade older than I was. We did a lot of politics together during presidential campaigns, got to know each other. We were both in Washington during those campaigns, became good friends and allies. And she was not a feminist at that point in her life. She, in fact, wanted to become president of the Center for National Policy. Ed Muskie, her former boss when she worked on Capitol Hill, and he was a senator, wasn't sure a woman should run the Center for National Policy. And I said to her, "Are you kidding? You were incredibly qualified." And so we put a strategy together, and she became the president. And we were fast friends after that. When she was the ambassador to the UN and I was working with Capitol Hill, we often worked together to try to get support for the United Nations, which wasn't always popular. Still isn't today for a lot of legitimate and illegitimate reasons. And then working for her and working with her as her counselor was an absolute joy. We really understood each other very well. She was in a tough position because she was the first woman Secretary of State. So she had all the challenges that come with that to prove that she actually had the bona fides to be there, which she most certainly did.
The most formative experience that you had working with Secretary Albright, at least from the outside, was negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program, which took up much of the latter half of the 90s and beyond. And you were the policy coordinator on North Korea in that time inside the State Department. And I'm wondering how you were able to build understanding, if not respect, then at least, or at least if not trust, then a kind of respect of your counterparty. You know, oftentimes in a setting like Munich, diplomacy happens among allies and friends. You know, who knows each other better than the members of the Transatlantic Alliance who get together every year at Munich? But here you have a country that has been closed, isolated, the Hermit Kingdom, as it's often called. So how do you go into those negotiations? What are you looking for? The signals, the signs, both explicit and implicit, of how you can understand the needs, the priorities, the fears, the context of your counterparty. Perhaps you can bring us back to those negotiations and how you, Secretary Albright, and others were trying to read the room and read the person sitting across the table from you.
So that's a great set of questions. interestingly, just as Madeleine was becoming Secretary of State, she had a meeting at her house to sort of talk with a bunch of advisors about what the priorities might be. And everyone in the room believed that within the first 2 years of her being secretary, the regime in North Korea would fall. That was the prevailing view all around the world. But of course, we were all wrong. But at the time, I said to her that as counselor, I'd like that to be one of my projects, to work with North Korea and South Korea and to try to move things forward. So President Clinton asked the former Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, to lead an effort to try to figure out how best to approach North Korea. And Secretary Albright asked me to be the person inside the department to work with Secretary Perry. And then when he stepped back, I became the North Korea policy coordinator. Bill Perry taught me something really important about diplomacy. He took his time. He talked with everybody who knew anything about North Korea, not only experts in the United States, and I was part of those discussions, but experts around the world. We traveled to South Korea, to Japan, to China, to talk to experts. And in fact, the National Security Advisor of South Korea, who of course spoke Korean, had read 10 books about Kim Jong-il, the then leader of North Korea, and had gone secretly on behalf of the president of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, to visit the North. And he came back and he said all 10 of the books were wrong, that he thought actually we could talk with them. And so ultimately, I went with Bill Perry and Ash Carter, who has now unfortunately passed away, and some of our other expert colleagues to North Korea. We didn't know if we'd be able to see Kim Jong-il, but we had all learned a great deal about North Korea, spent also time talking to our intelligence community about North Korea. So what Secretary Perry taught me is you really have to understand the history, the culture, the context, the ambition of your adversary or the country with whom you're going to negotiate before you even enter the room. Bill Perry spent months doing that before we ever went to North Korea. And it's critical. So when we went to North Korea, we didn't know if we'd see Kim Jong-il. We weren't able to, but we met with the head of their defense. We met with the head of their diplomats. We met with the man who would be ultimately my counterpart in trying to negotiate something. And we learned a lot. And we offered for North Korea to come to the United States. It took 10 months. But 10 months later, all of a sudden, a military general showed up in the United States of America, and that led to Madeleine Albright's historic visit to North Korea.
Speaking of that visit, of course, Secretary Albright does get an audience with Kim Jong-il, and there's one detail that came out of that meeting that struck me, which is she later travels to South Korea afterwards to brief officials there, as well as the Japanese foreign minister. And that cable, or a cable that came out of that meeting, has since been declassified. So we get a bit of inside the room detail from there, but I hope to get a bit more from you. And what jumped out at me is the way that Secretary Albright says that Kim Jong-il was not as she expected, or as many others expected. He was not this kind of strange, detached, hypersensitive figure, but rather quite pragmatic, practical. And she includes this detail of in his office, he had 3 computers, and he asked for the email address of the State Department. And that alone, that detail seemed to matter or say something to Secretary Albright about who she and the United States were dealing with. And I wonder, what was it about those details that struck her? I believe you were also in the room for both of those meetings.
Yes.
So talk a bit about, in the context of my previous question, of what you're looking for as a diplomat, what you're scanning for in the room, what you're paying attention to, the kinds of details that inform your picture of your counterparty in any negotiation.
So when we met with Kim Jong-il in a formal negotiation session, he sat above us on sort of like a dais in the same way members of Congress would. And of course, it's meant to make us feel lesser than he is. And he is the president of a country. Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State. But he had my counterpart sitting next to him, but he knew all of the details of our discussions at lower levels. There were 14 points of concern that we had, and he went through each one of them. And although he didn't know all of the technical issues, he knew quite a bit. And I think that said to us that he actually wanted a negotiation. He actually wanted a result because he had clearly invested some time into learning what was necessary. I think the other thing that struck the secretary and I, he was very personable and quite protective of us. At one of the banquets, as you may know, drinking soju is part of the ritual of a banquet. And so a colleague of his, one of his military people, walked the room pouring more into everyone's glass. And when he came to us, Kim Jong-il waved him off because we were women, for one. And secondly, he understood we needed to refuse. We didn't want to, in fact, get drunk, as I must say some of my colleagues did, and wanted to be able to keep our heads about us. So it was a very substantive set of discussions that led then to a meeting in Kuala Lumpur with some of our experts and ended up with a return of further discussions, which ultimately did not get to where we wanted it to get because the Clinton administration ran out of time.
Pity the North Korean waiter who accidentally poured the American guest some shoju against the great leader's wishes. I wouldn't want to be in his position. But I want to talk and spend some real time on the signal period in your diplomatic career, the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, as it's more commonly known, which you spearheaded on behalf of the U.S. as part of the P5+1 negotiations with Iran. Those negotiations came about as the result or after a previous round of extensive back-channel talks, informal communications between American and Iranian representatives in Oman, other places. And I want to talk about, before we get to the formal period, the JCPOA talks that you led, if you could explain in this context and more generally the interplay between informal and formal in diplomacy, why back-channel talks are necessary, why can't you just get straight down to talking about the real business at hand at a table with the counterparty, right? Why do you have to do this cloak and dagger, clandestine series of meetings in third-party capitals? How did that work, and why did that matter in the Iran case, and what may be a larger lesson from that?
So I'm going to go back one more step, because it's important for all of us to understand that for a decade, Europe had been talking with Iran and trying to make progress. And ultimately, a resolution was passed at the United Nations that said that the High Representative of the European Union would lead a negotiation with the P5+1, or as Europeans like to say, the E3+3. So I want to give tribute to Europe because they understood a great deal about Iran, which they could share with the United States. Now, why do we need a back channel? It's very interesting what happened in the case of the United States. Bill Burns had gone to a meeting with Iran and the Europeans. That was the first time that the U.S. had been in the room. It did not amount to a great deal, but it did provide some insight. And then John Kerry, who was then a senator and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate, got a message from Oman that indeed Iran was interested in talking with the United States. And he went to Secretary Clinton and said, I think this is legitimate. And everyone understood there probably wouldn't be a deal unless the United States was involved in some way, because if a deal didn't work and military action was necessary, it would be the U.S. military that would have to act. And so Secretary Clinton went to President Obama and said, can I explore this relationship? And she sent a couple of her colleagues to meet with the envoy from Iran in Muscat in Oman. And they came back and said, well, we think there may be something here. And so she got President Obama's permission to send Bill Burns and Jake Sullivan to meet with this envoy and with the Iranians. And that began the secret channel. Now, why do you need secrecy? You need secrecy so everybody has deniability. You need secrecy so you can put some ideas on the table without them being known by the world and trashed by your opponents before you even have a chance to negotiate. You can test out ideas without fear that they will be thrown out before you have a chance to discuss them. And President Obama also made a critical decision. Many Europeans and others in the world believe that the Non-Proliferation Treaty permitted countries to enrich uranium. The United States never thought that that right existed in the NPT. But President Obama told Bill and Jake that he would consider allowing some enrichment under very strict monitoring and verification. And that opened the door to getting the joint plan of action, the deal that ostensibly opened the door for a 6-month negotiation with the Europeans, coordinated by the High Representative of the European Union, to get a final agreement. Obviously, that 6 months turned into 18 months before we reached the JCPOA.
And so those negotiations, the formal part, begins in November of 2013, and you're at the helm of the U.S. team. And I want you to talk a bit about building understanding, lines of communication, rapport with your counterparties, and what are going to be very both drawn out, but quite stressful, I think exhausting negotiations for all parties. And there's this moment when you are first meeting or first beginning to speak with Abbas Araghchi and Majid Takht Ravanchi, the main Iranian negotiators. And as per custom, they are forbidden or declined to shake hands with a woman, which tends to create some awkwardness across negotiations in the Middle East. People don't know what to do. You've written about this in your book, Not for the Faint of Heart, a memoir and tale of your time in the diplomatic service. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about how you overcame what could have been a potential moment of awkwardness. You know, do you fist bump or what is the workaround for that? And you turned what could have been a moment of some, discord or awkwardness into actually a way of bonding with the negotiators. Could you tell us that story?
Sure. Well, two things. First of all, what we women do is put our hand over our chest and sort of bow. But if you do that in a room, you do look like a Marx Brothers routine. After a while, it's a little silly, but necessary. And at one point on the margins of a discussion we were having, I decided I would take a risk. Certainly, the Iranians knew not only that I was a woman, but that I was a Jewish American, which also had its own awkwardness. But I said to Abbas and Majid, it's interesting. I have to put my hand over my chest and bow. I can't shake hands with you, but this is not new. I grew up in a Jewish community, and Orthodox Jewish men cannot shake my hand either. So I would always wait for whoever I met with in the community. If it was a man, if he put out his hand, I knew he could shake it. If he didn't put out his hand, I knew he could not. And so then we got into a little bit of a discussion about the Jewish community in Iran. Some of what they told me was, I believe, not true, but they made a point of telling me there was a Jewish member of their modulus, their parliament. And it doesn't change that I had to do what the president and the secretary of state had asked me to do. It doesn't change what they have been asked to do, but it just takes down a little of the edge in your ability to understand each other and approach each other. I think it's also important, Josh, since you're talking about the beginning of all this, to acknowledge that although I led the day-to-day team, none of this could happen without President Obama, who knew every detail, Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry, who knew every detail, Secretary Moniz, our Secretary of Energy, who was indispensable in this negotiation because he was a nuclear physicist, and literally hundreds of people in the U.S. government and many, many people in the governments of the P5+1. It really is an all-hands-on-deck effort, which makes me concerned about the current effort because I don't know who the team is. I only know who the senior leadership is, and I don't know that they have the expertise they need to get the job done.
Yeah, we'll certainly turn to the current moment in terms of negotiations with Iran shortly. I just want to ask a few more questions about the JCPOA period. You talk about softening the edge. I wonder how that worked over time. These were really marathon negotiations. I don't have the Guinness Book of Diplomatic Records in front of me, but I think these are probably approaching a record in terms of the duration, nearly 2 years. By the end, Secretary Kerry spends something like 2 weeks or more on the ground in Switzerland. I think that's basically unprecedented that someone of that rank would be sitting in one place overseeing negotiations.
Yes.
And so how did the interplay, relations between the parties unfold over time, both between, say, the Iranian side, but also inside your own team? You know, do people grow closer? Do they grow sick of each other? I can imagine a moment where you've been painstakingly negotiating some wording, finally you have it all agreed, and a younger specialist, technical expert comes in the room, the bearer of bad news, and says, I'm sorry, but actually I think we need to scrap this wording and redo it because it's actually not in accordance with this or that technical detail or doesn't take it into account. And you probably, wish that person could just leave the room and you never heard that, meddlesome detail. So I just wonder this time issue of how it weighed on you, how it weighed on the team, and how you think it affected both the tenor and outcome of the negotiations.
So that's really the job of a day-to-day team leader, is to take all these disparate people and create a group so that people really feel like they are part of something and they're invested in each other and each other's expertise. And building that team is critical. When we first began, I asked folks who were the experts to write what they thought would be an ideal deal. It was like 100 pages long. I made everybody, including the administrative staff, to sit in a conference room for 2 days and go over it line by line. So we each understood what we were trying to accomplish. And if I didn't understand something technically, I wanted explained to me. And everybody then knew who would take the lead on what part of this negotiation. And it began to create a team. And over time, it was just extraordinary. Everybody was at the table at the beginning of each day and at the end of each day. At some point, Iran got mad at me because of something I said, which was not very wise of me, in a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing. And so they did cartoons of me as a fox up in a tree. There were posters in Iran that said, "Death to Wendy Sherman," people on the streets. It was a very concerning time for my family, to say the least.
Can I ask what the inopportune remark was?
Sure. I said that deception was in their DNA in response to a question that asked, are they deceptive? I should not have said that. I said in a Voice of America Persian program, I set it up so they would ask me about it, and I said I regretted those words. So we got past it. But what it did create was my team making T-shirts that said, which every negotiation needs, that said, "We are now Team Silver Fox." Silver because of my hair and fox because of these cartoons. So the team did things to try to keep their spirits up. At one point, they started to cast who would play whom in the movie. Javier Bardem would play Ernie Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, because of their common hair. Meryl Streep, because The Devil Wears Prada, would play me, which I was very grateful for.
The audience doesn't necessarily see the video of this, I don't think, but here I am looking at you and can confirm, Meryl Streep, if you're listening, you're exactly the right fit for the Wendy Sherman role.
So, you do things to try to keep your spirits up. During the very difficult months that we spent in a hotel in Vienna at the end, I ate exactly one meal outside of the hotel. I tried to arrange, the Europeans could go home for a day or even a weekend and come back. Harder for the US to do, but I tried to arrange a rolling process so some of my team could go home back to the US for 2 or 3 days, see their families. We didn't have all of the things we have now to be able to stay in touch. We didn't have Zoom then, to stay in touch with your loved ones. One of my team's kids made sock puppets for everybody and sent them to Vienna. So, you figure out what will keep you going through a really hard time.
Last question about that period, which is also a question about how to turn difficulty into opportunity. And that is to get you or to ask you to expand on, just as the negotiations were coming to a close, right? There are these difficulties that the U.S. or 5+1 side is encountering. You have this open letter from then Senator Tom Cotton, essentially warning Iran that future administrations might not abide by the agreement. Turns out he was right about that. And also you had a really full court press lobbying push from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who comes to the U.S., addresses Congress, does his own lobbying against the deal. And that's happening at the same time that your Iranian counterparties, negotiators, are also telling you, you're pushing us too hard, you're asking us for things that our own hardliners back in Tehran are not going to like or not going to abide by. And you turned those kind of mutual parallel difficulties into a kind of bonding moment. I don't know if that's the right word, but maybe you could expand on that and how you turned some political headwinds on your side into diplomatic opportunity.
Yeah, when that letter came from Tom Cotton, it gave me an opportunity. You never, as a negotiator, waste anything. And so I turned to Abbas and Majid and I said, you complain to me all of the time about how you have political interests that make it difficult. And, that's true for every country. Why? You tell me you need my help. Well, I'm telling you, I need your help to counter what I have to deal with, what my government has to deal with. And so I think you need to just always look to see what you can use to move forward. As I think you noted earlier on, Josh, for me, it's never about trust, really. The Iranians don't trust me. I don't trust them. But I did come to respect them, their capabilities, that they had interests, the hard work they had to do, the political issues they had to deal with. And it's not that we were complete equals. We weren't. We were trying to get them to do something. The international community was trying to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. But nonetheless, just because you have a supreme leader doesn't mean you don't have politics. And they did have politics. And I needed to understand that to make sure I kept our interests first and foremost, of course, but took into account what could make this deal work. And the one other point I'll make, which you referred to earlier, is the young person on my team who came to me towards the end when I saw the end in sight and said, I have 52 concerns and I thought I would die. But it was my job to sit down patiently and listen to them all and to see what we could do. Fortunately, many of them were technical and had to go to Secretary Moniz. But by the end of the negotiation, virtually all of them had been accounted for. And you just have to take a deep breath at difficult times and figure out if there's another way forward. There's usually a way, but you've got to have enough patience and you have to have enough fortitude As I said, as the subtitle of the book, not only is this not for the faint of heart, but it takes courage, understanding of power, and probably above all, persistence.
With those values in mind, let's talk about the current moment. We're talking here end of June, so about 3.5 months after the U.S. and Israeli military campaign against Iran began, and a year or so after a shorter bombing campaign aimed specifically at Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Talk to me about your understanding of the basic calculus of this administration, the Trump administration, versus the Obama one. Is there actually an analytical difference you can point to, a kind of base set of assumptions that this administration had about Iran, had about the prospects or utility of diplomacy with Iran, about the cost-benefit of a military campaign versus a diplomatic process, the urgency of the nuclear program? Is there actually an analytical difference here that you can point to and unpack a bit between the two U.S. administrations?
Well, I'm going to try to be analytical, but I can't begin to understand what is in the president's head a great deal of the time, but I'll try to be analytical here. I think that the kind of diplomacy we did, there was always a credible threat of force on the table. And I think to do this kind of negotiation, you need a credible threat in service of diplomacy, as opposed to what the Trump administration did, which was to believe in a military-first approach to create leverage for diplomacy. In fact, what they got was a misunderstanding of the asymmetry of an ostensibly weaker adversary. And it's not like this is the first time we've seen this. In Vietnam, we tried a conventional war, and the Viet Cong used guerrilla warfare, which we desperately tried to adapt to, but ultimately got to a peace process because fighting was not going to resolve Vietnam. And we've done this again and again. The United States has an exquisite, capable military, just amazing. And tactically, the military has done a spectacular job in Iran, but strategically, it doesn't create a solution. Only diplomacy will do that. And I think the president, one of the things one of my former colleagues, Rob Malley and Steve Wertheimer, wrote in the New York Times this morning as we're doing this podcast, that one of the positive outcomes out of this disastrous war of choice is that maybe people finally will understand that a military-first approach is not a solution. That when you have a culture of resistance, like the Viet Cong, or like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, they are not going to give up. And ultimately, you will come to a negotiation, and that the adversary often has, as Iran had the Strait of Hormuz, bombing our partners and allies in the region, our bases in the region, asymmetric ways to fight your very, very capable conventional military.
I'm glad you mentioned this point about leverage, because I wanted to ask you about how it worked both in the context of the JCPOA and how you think it's working now in regards to Iran. It seems to me that the problem, or the way that the U.S. lacks leverage now, is having started the war, Trump very quickly realized actually he wanted out of it. The regime didn't collapse. Costs, economic, political, started to mount, and the U.S. was actually desperate to end the war, and that desperation gave or gives Iran a lot of leverage because, in fact, the U.S. perhaps needs or wants the war to end more than Iran does. Back in the JCPOA days, I don't know if it's quite fair to say the situation was somehow reversed or kind of mirrored, but you had a situation in which Obama had both announced and also made implicitly clear that he really wanted to avoid armed conflict. Of course, the military option was formally on the table, but I think it was quite clear to all players, including the Iranians, that Obama would do a whole lot to avoid a military conflict. And I wonder if that also affected, detrimentally or otherwise, the U.S.'s leverage, question of credibility. I wonder if you could just compare the ordering of the military solution, right? Whether it comes first and then meant to lead to diplomacy, or whether it's kept as a measure of last resort, but all parties know it's not really going to be used, or the main potential implementer of that force doesn't want to use it. Walk me through the calculations around leverage and credibility in both situations.
So I'll get to that in a second, but I do want to say there's a couple of differences between then and now. First, the JCPOA was done with partners, coordinated by the European Union. Russia, China, the UK, Germany, France, the European Union were all part of that negotiation. Helga Schmidt, who was first Cathy Ashton's and Federica Mogherini's, the High Representative's deputy, is the unsung hero of these negotiations. She kept it all going. She kept us all together. She was an extraordinary diplomat who really had the pen for the final document. So that created a difference in that we were not only negotiating with Iran, we were negotiating with our partners, but we also had their leverage. We knew that the Russians could talk to the Iranians and push them to do things that perhaps we or the Europeans could not, that China played a different role. So just the whole negotiation process was different. This was actually a bilateral action, perhaps with the Gulf states on one hand, hoping it would be successful, but then seeing what it was doing to their economies, to their safety, to their facilities, and not being so excited about what it meant over the longer term. So it's a very different negotiation. The other way this is quite different is that when we were negotiating, Iran had only gotten to 20% enriched uranium. Iran now, because Trump got out of the deal, and Iran being wary of negotiating with the U.S., wouldn't get very far with the Biden administration, now had 60% capabilities, which is much closer to the 90%, obviously, that you need for fissile material for a nuclear weapon. So the challenge for the U.S. and for the world, quite frankly, is much greater, much more difficult. You cannot bomb away knowledge. And that is fundamentally what Barack Obama understood, that the Iranians had mastered the entire fuel cycle. And so negotiations were necessary. He let them know, we let them know, that he had created this massive ordnance penetrator that could get to the underground sites. There was a military solution. They also didn't have as many sites then as they have now for their nuclear program. They've now used advanced centrifuges, so it's a very different situation. In terms of leverage, I think President Obama not only had the leverage of the United States, but of our partners as well. And that was very valuable. Of course, that kind of leverage doesn't exist. And in fact, Russia and China have probably one way or another helped the Iranians during this war, with intelligence, if nothing else. And obviously, we all knew, every president before Trump knew that the Strait of Hormuz was a possible leverage point, that bombing was a possible leverage point. We had all gamed it out. We all knew it. Why President Trump did not understand this, I'm sure he was told. Can
we talk actually a bit about that scenario or scenario planning more broadly, how it looks and feels and works? Because, of course, that quickly became the key issue. That became Iran's main pressure point that really seems to have forced the U.S. into negotiations, or the need to negotiate for both economic and political reasons. As you said, geography was not secret to anyone 10 years ago. The Strait of Hormuz was and is this key transit point for the global energy trade. And given the geography of the region, Iran has this strategic position to potentially dominate it or kind of exercise strategic control over the strait. So what did you and your team imagine would happen if, say, there was a military campaign? What would Iran do vis-a-vis the Strait of Hormuz? What was expected? And also, what would or could the U.S. and its partners do about it, if anything? How did those scenarios look at the time that you and your team were running through them?
So we did simulations, we did gaming, we red teamed this, all of the things that one does to really understand the dynamics. We had no doubt that Iran would try to mine the strait. Laying mines is not hard. Fast boats can do that. You don't need battleships to do that. And demining is much harder. takes more time, obviously is dangerous. So we knew that. We talked about what we would do in that circumstance, how we would manage it if it happened, how to avoid it happening. It was well known to us. It was well known to George Bush. It was well known to every president before Donald Trump.
Given your experience of 10 years ago, and the way that the success or the achievement of the JCPOA was quickly undone by the Trump administration, ultimately years later led to war, and looking at how negotiations are unfolding now, again in Switzerland, what's your sense, what's your prognosis for whether a long-term agreement is even possible? Does Iran have the interest and motivation to actually again embark and sign off on a set of long-term agreements with the United States? Does the U.S. have credibility?
I think Iran is quite wary. Negotiations just started with them at other times, and even as they were going on, we attacked. The president has said even since the MOU, he has threatened Iran, even though the MOU says neither country will threaten each other. So it's very fragile, to say the least. I think Iran will try to get everything it can up front, as opposed to after the fact. They've already gotten quite a bit by getting the oil sanctions off, getting some of the frozen assets released. I think it is going to be quite difficult to get to a positive outcome here. I certainly hope the United States can. The Qataris and the Pakistanis are trying to help that happen. At least everybody is in the same room at the same time. At least it appears that way. It's impossible to do this kind of technical negotiation through indirect talks. There has to be direct discussion between the United States and Iran to ever get there. The IAEA has to be part of it for verification and monitoring. So I'm not optimistic, but I'm going to try to remain hopeful.
And I also wonder, as one scans the horizon of geopolitics, looking to Ukraine, now going into fifth year of war, North Korea, and how this administration has dealt with the leadership there. I wonder what the lesson is about nuclear weapons, and for Iran as well, right? In terms of whether or not, given the state of geopolitics, kind of raw power, realpolitik era in which we live, if actually those begin to look like perhaps the one lever that actually, or the one instrument that can actually somehow protect you, make your power credible, ward off, deter adversaries. I wonder what the lesson here is for Iran and whether they would agree to the kinds of limitations that they did agree to 10 years ago in the JCPOA. Is that even realistic or logical from their perspective anymore?
I think that Iran is controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and hardliners, but they are pragmatic in the sense that they know their economy is in dire shape, and that means the chances of more protests and more opprobrium from the world community as they slaughter protesters. So I think they're going to try to see what they can get without giving up that right to have a nuclear weapon. And I think the chances that they make the decision to have a nuclear weapon has gone up, not down, when in fact I think before this war they were not and had not made the decision to have a nuclear weapon. North Korea certainly thinks it's in the catbird seat because of all the nuclear weapon capacity it has. But quite frankly, Josh, one of the greatest concerns here is what lessons China has taken out of this vis-a-vis Taiwan, and whether the United States will come to Taiwan's defense or whether President Trump will decide that's just too hard and defer to China. That would be quite concerning for any number of security reasons, both in true security terms, economic security terms, AI security terms, and much more in terms of who the United States is and what we hope to do to support the world's economy and humanity. We're in a really difficult, changing time, and I think all of us are uncertain about the future, and we have to work as hard as we can to be true to the values of our democracy.
Of course, one difference between the negotiations of 10 years ago and these seems to be in the composition of who's in the room, the delegations, the teams. You talked about all the experts you brought from not just the defense side, but the Department of Energy side and so on. What sort of difference does that make, having the technical experts in the room on your team or not? On the one hand, perhaps I could see an argument for, you know what, let's keep this thing small, limited. It gives us a better shot at a quick deal. Too many experts in the room just means we're going to end up with a document that's 500 pages and no one can agree on. I believe you were going to have a different opinion about the importance of having those experts in the room, and that actually is the thing that allows for a durable, lasting agreement to happen. But I wonder if you could just talk to me about having the experts with you versus not, and the pros and cons of that.
Well, you know, the experts may not be in every room all of the time. And certainly at the end of the JCPOA, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, myself, Secretary Kerry's Chief of Staff, Helga Schmidt, maybe one or two other people were in the room with the Iranians, and Helga would go out and talk to the other delegations and tell them what was going on. If calculations had to be made, experts were asked in a separate room to make those calculations. So there are all kinds of permutations of this. But if you do not have that expertise available to you, you really are not going to know what you've agreed to. And the IAEA will not know what it has to monitor and verify. And you will never know if you have gotten what you think you got.
Right. About the future, I want to ask whether or not the era of treaties as we've known them or knew them in the 20th century going into the 21st has passed. The JCPOA itself was not a treaty. It was an executive action for the reason that it would have had a very difficult, or in fact just impossible, time to be ratified in the Senate as a treaty. Of course, we've seen this on the U.S. side in domestic politics now for successive administrations, where big landmark legislation rarely happens. The filibuster, other mechanisms make that kind of legislation very hard to pass. So instead, we have presidents using executive orders, which, of course, like Senator Tom Cotton warned in that op-ed about the Iran deal, can be undone by the next administration, which is exactly what happened. And I wonder, in this era of political fragmentation, partisanship, it seems like so much in politics is temporary, huge swings in policy. Populism is on the rise, incumbent parties being thrown out, and so on. Is there a short-termism that's taken hold in not just domestic politics, but geopolitics that's become increasingly difficult or impossible to overcome? And what does that mean for the future of diplomacy itself if long-term agreements no longer seem possible or credible?
So yes, there may be some of that, but I would remind all of us that when World War I was over, people said that was the war to end all wars. And 20 years later, which is not very much time in history, we had World War II. So although the short-termism may be of a different quality and kind in this technological world, it is not altogether new. And it is why that word persistence is so important, because, you know, Abbas Arachi would always say to me, how will I know that the next U.S. president will stay with this? And I would say to him, how do I know that your president, your government, your supreme leader will stay with this? None of us knows. So you have to create the most durable possible answer that you can, and then work hard to try to maintain it. Sometimes you can't, as we've seen, and you have to go back at it again. As I said, I'm not sure that we will get there this time round for any number of reasons. But for the sake of the United States of America and the entire world, even though I don't think they have the right team, I hope they get there anyway.
Well, I've been not just informed, but invigorated by your hope, which I'll choose to adopt for myself as well. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sherman. Really appreciate this conversation and all your insights.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks very much.
You have been listening to The Art of Diplomacy, a podcast of the Munich Security Conference, produced by Studio Bummens. The show is hosted by Florence Gaup and Joshua Yaffa, with original music by Jakob Ilya. The Munich Security Conference production team includes Andreas Block, Marit Zeisler, Judith Sorden, Noor Saad, and Annalena Enold. For more on this year's Munich Security Conference and for footnotes and references for this episode, please consider our show notes. Most of the conversations in this podcast were recorded at Bayerischer Hof at the Munich Security Conference in mid-February 2026. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show and leave a review. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.